Association webinar series. And today we are going to be talking about how to read a COA. There's been lots of questions about this, and we're going to demystify it. My name's Stephanie Ostrander, and I am the account manager of Keystone Labs, and you can see my contact information on the screen. And I am joined with...
I am Rachel Fontaine, working for Phytokenya, based in Chicoutimi, Quebec. Working as a chemist there, and then you also have my contact information down there.
Right, and both of us work for labs that are quite visible on social media, so feel free to follow us and engage, and anytime you have questions, reach out to us, whether through the website or social media, as well as C45. So let's get started. What is a COA? Well, COA stands for Certificate of Analysis.
No.
Certificate of Analysis is a required document provided with some manufactured products such as food, chemicals, research products, pharmaceuticals, and cannabis. It reports on the testing and quality assessment of the production lot, ensuring that the released product meets the desired quality standards, compliance.
Hey Rod, do you want to send me last week's PowerPoint of the dark side, and I can start the BD?
Last week was we just showcased Aisha, so
Okay.
but I will send it to you. You can use the week before.
Okay. Yep. And I'll start that. Oh no, why?
Just gotta get over to that.
Yeah, for sure. After is fine. Yeah. No.
Process. If we try to understand what's around the regulation with cannabis, let's take a look at what are Health Canada's limits. Normally, limits are chosen by the producers based on the intended use, except for pesticide. And this is referring to pharmacopoeias from the Schedule B. The problem with that is it's very confusing. We don't really know what are the limits exactly. So what happened is that different party can pick different limits. So the tips to go around that is to make sure that you have a spec sheet listing all the limits that you chose, and then you can share that with all your business partners. That includes your lab, your suppliers, your clients. So really everybody that works around. So if we don't do this way, what happens is that people can have different understanding, pick different limits, and it can bring business conflicts.
And if you need some education around specifications, ask your lab to help you to understand what they are, how they can affect the intended use of your product as well. Most labs will be happy to educate you. They can't or they shouldn't make these decisions for you, but they absolutely can help educate you.
Now, if we're taking a closer look at the report, there are a few information that can be presented. It can change a little bit from lab to lab, but quite often you'll see the dates, the method, client, lot number, results, units, the lab ID as well. This is not an exhaustive list, but that's usually common information that you'll find.
So here is an example of a COA, and maybe I'll just there we go, move this over. So there's the company logo is usually at the top left with the address. You'll have the client's name. You'll have the sample description. This is from the client. And then you're going to have the lab will assign a number to the testing. And then you're going to have, the company will assign a number to the whole job, not just the individual samples. There might be a sample handling number, an invoice number, and the date that the testing was complete. So if we look at this screen, we will see a description of the test. This is a full panel report of all of the types of testing that is required by Health Canada. So this was likely dried flour, and it was tested for everything, including potency, all of the microbiology, pesticides, heavy metals, aflatoxin, and that's what you'll see usually on the left-hand side. The method will be listed, and this is the specifications actually. So methods and specifications are kind of similar. Specifications are the actual chapter in the, or actually, Rochelle, did I say that correctly?
Yeah, well, specification would be the limits. The other is the method. So it's what the lab should do and how they do. That's the method.
Right, sorry, yeah, exactly. And the assay is the number that is assigned to the lab's experiment. So this also, when you look at assays, there will be SOPs on how they've done the testing. And this is really important. The lab can refer back to their assay to ensure that everything was done properly. If a client is questioning a result, in the result column, so for potency, it's going to be an actual number, and we will get to the details on the next following slides. With microbiology, you're going to have an over the limit or under the limit, and it will essentially be pass or fail. Not every lab will write pass or fail. This is something that is more client, for the client to look at, for them to have more easy understanding. It might say below the limits, like this report in the case of pesticides, it says below the limits, but then there's another attached document that will list every individual pesticide, all 96 of them. And then at the bottom, you want to make sure that it was signed by a qualified person. If you have any questions about these reports, you can ask them at the end of the webinar during the Q&A portion. Oh, wait.
So now once you,
okay.
Once you have your COA and you looked at the result, you want to do the data interpretation. Especially you want to compare if the result match the specification that you chose, because sometimes some labs can present limits, but are they really the ones that you picked? It's important to check to make sure that your results are in compliance with your quality program. An easy way that you can do that is to build your own compliance report, because probably with all the analysis that you need, your lab will send you a lot of documentation. So when you build your compliance report, it makes all the information easy to find in one place. So usually that report will be a one-pager listing all the analysis you did with the limits and the result. And you can attach that a pass or fail. On this slide, I put some examples of the analysis that you could have picked with some limits as well. This is just an example, so you could put different limits in there. It could be your limits or your client's limits. It really depends what's the purpose of this document. With the result, the status, pass or fail. You could put the reference to the limit as well. A lot of QAs like to have that information. So really, this one is a document that you could create with your own headers, company, and everything. And to that document, you can attach all the lab COAs, because this is still the legal document proving that the results are these results.
Okay, so for potency, depending on how many cannabinoids you've asked to have tested, Health Canada definitely wants to see THC and CBD totals, and that's for labeling purposes. So on this COA, we see THC and THCA, and on the bottom of the report, you're actually going to see total THC, and at the very bottom in the notes, it will tell you how that calculation was made. THCA turns into THC, and there is a calculation. The same with CBD. And when you see the acronym BLQ, that stands for below quantitation. Some labs will report in milligrams per gram as Health Canada wants it. So I should say all labs will report that way. Some labs will also give the reporting in weight per weight. So on this lab report, we have both. Also with potency, something to note, sometimes a producer will say, hey, you know, my THC should be a lot higher. You know, look at the whole report. There is probably clues as to why THC might have been lower. And sometimes when I'm looking at a report with a client, if they have elevated CBG, that will tell me that they harvested a little bit early and that their THC could have been longer if the product had been on the vine or the plant longer. This is another example of a potency report. So the layout looks quite different, but it does have the same information. Every lab is different in how it presents the information, but if you look hard enough, you'll see the same elements.
So here I'll talk a bit about the anhydrous result versus the as-is concentration. In the previous report that we've seen, both were reported. So that is the difference between the two comes from moisture. So the anhydrous results are normally calculated on the dry mass, which is calculated with moisture measurement. It gives a theoretical concentration if the sample was 100% dry. So usually anhydrous result will be used for R&D mostly, because Health Canada is requesting the as-is concentration, because it is what the customer will have in their hands at the end. Because usually the anhydrous result is a little bit higher, so this could be false information to the customer. So that's a bit the difference between the two. Moisture. So we've had also a lot of questions around moisture, because it is an analysis that is easy to monitor and process. So sometimes results are a bit different, but why are they different? It comes from the method itself, because the common analysis to do for moisture is the loss on drying, and USP explained the scope of the method like this. So it says the procedure sets for in this chapter determine the amount of volatile matter of any kind that is driven off under the conditions specified. So based on this definition, it means that the result can be different depending on the chosen condition. And by condition here, we mean a lot. It can be many things. It could be the drying technique. The drying technique could be in an oven, in a vacuum oven, freeze dryer. Some people use moisture analyzer. The drying time can change. The temperature can change. So all these factors could affect how the samples react to the drying process. And it could also influence the kind of volatile compound that we're going to lose in the process. Because as the definition mentioned, it's the volatile matter of any kind, not just only water that we lose, but it's the method accepted globally.
Okay, so this is appearance, and Health Canada does want to see that there are no pests or visible disease of the product. And from a lab point of view, a lab client point of view, this can be important as well. The lab will describe what the sample looks like. So, for example, if you had a THC result that was kind of low, and when we look at the appearance, if the appearance included, oh, there was sticks and leaves and the buds were quite small, that's a clue right there as to maybe why the THC was a little bit lower. So always send your best sample in and just make sure that the description, really accurately reflects your product. And if it is talking about trichomes, that the buds were actually nice, there was no pests, there was no sticks and leaves and seeds in the sample, and lots of trichomes, and that's an important indication of a good sample. This next one is microbiology, and it is required testing by Health Canada. They actually want to see total aerobic count. They want to see total yeast and mold, absence of Salmonella and E. coli, as well as bile tolerant gram negative. All of those individual tests are going to be listed. The method used, this is really important actually, because the intended use of your product is going to affect potentially the sample size and definitely the specifications. If your product is going to be going to go to a distillation, it's going to be extracted and become a distillate. You may want to test against inhalation specs or not, completely up to you. What we understand from Health Canada is they're more concerned about heavy metals in this case. But for example, if this is going to be made into a product for cutaneous use, this can affect your specification. So make sure you understand the intended use of your product or who's going to be buying your product. If an extraction company is going to buy your product in order to be extraction, you might also want to ask them, what specifications do you want to see, especially if you're a cultivator. And then the results are going to be based on pharmacopoeia limits. And it is going to be reported in either parts per million or coliform units. Coliforming units, sorry. And in this case, we see pass or fail. Yeah, and of course, it's got to be under the limit, but you also, with microbiology, if you want to have your product treated, at least there's an opportunity for remediation if you don't pass. Here's another example from another COA of what the microbiology section would look like. And you see the CFU per gram. And you can also see here, it exactly, the accepted criteria. So it might look different from lab to lab, but the information is essentially the same. E. coli salmonella, you must demonstrate that it's absent in whatever the specification you chose, whether it's 25 grams or 1 gram or 10 grams. So talk to your lab about this.
Another analysis is the residual solvent analysis. There seems to be a little bit of confusion around this analysis. So let's start with a few questions. So when is it required? It is only required if you use solvents in your extraction process or production. So if you're only like drying flower buds, this is not required. Then which solvent should be tested? It is only the solvents that was used in process. And then last question, what if an ingredient contains residual solvents? So let's say you're making edibles, you're adding an extract that has residual solvents. When should we test? It's only required if the calculated concentration would be above the limit, because you're adding so much stuff to the extract. If the calculation is under the limit, it's not considered a risk anymore. So why is there so much confusion around residual solvents? It's because Health Canada published their residual solvent list, and this list is no longer used as of October 2019. So now what Health Canada is asking for residual solvents is to test it based on the intended use according to the Schedule B, as most of the other analysis. We didn't put any COA example for this service in particular because we don't offer this service in our labs, but it's a service that could be requested if you do extracts or any synthetic cannabinoids.
And if your lab doesn't perform residual solvent testing, likely they might have a subcontractor. So still ask those important questions. So heavy metals, right now, Health Canada is only concerned about 4 heavy metals: lead, mercury, cadmium, and arsenic. And again, you will need to understand specifications. This is really important with inhalation. If your product is being inhaled, you're gonna wanna use very specific specifications so that the lab can test at a much lower limit. If you want to test for other heavy metals, talk to your lab about this. You don't want to raise any red flags with Health Canada that are unnecessary. So yeah. And here is a different example of a COA. And again, it's just arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury. That's the big concern. Heavy metals, once they are in your body, they cannot get out. So this is really important. It's a good idea, even though it's not necessarily required on your COA, is to keep an eye on your water. Water is one of the ways that heavy metals does get into products. So test your water, whether it's well water, city water. If you're doing reverse osmosis, that's great. Test your production water actually before it gets put into reverse osmosis or treatment, and test it regularly after. Even though it's all of these aren't required, it is really important. And when I say required, I just mean on the COA. Yes, Health Canada does want to see that you are testing it, but it is super important.
Another service is pesticides and mycotoxin. So on this COA at the top, we put the highlights quickly. You can see if it passes or fail. Again, it's still important to make sure that the limits are the one that you want to use. So at the top, we have the mycotoxin results, and at the bottom, the 96 pesticide that were cropped up because it's quite long. You can see as well in the COA the limit of detection, the maximum tolerated. What's important to know as well for the pesticide analysis is that this analysis is mandatory on dry cannabis. But if the cannabis is being further transformed, as for example, with extracts or doing other product with it, it doesn't have to be further tested. So if the cannabis that goes in is clean, you don't need to test further. All you need is to show the COA for the initial cannabis. If you can demonstrate traceability, then it should be sufficient for Health Canada.
Another thing to note about pesticides is to ensure that your lab has validated not only the whole method, but all 96 pesticides individually. It's an important question to ask.
And last analysis, but not the least, terpene analysis. So here we have a COA example of what we do at phytochemia. So at the top, we see that the results are reported on an anhydrous basis. At any time, if you have the moisture analysis, you can convert an anhydrous result to as is or reverse. But it is important to know what your lab has been testing to make sure that it is what you need. So here we have a list of some of the terpene that were tested for this cannabis specifically. We see the concentration being reported in milligram per gram and the family of terpene. At phytochemia, we have a bit of a different approach for terpene analysis. So we do a broad screening and we identify the terpene through our database, which is a little bit different than the classical approach, where one terpene would be quantified against one standard. So this is why we might report more terpene than other labs. And the amount of terpene that you report as well could influence the total terpene, which would be the number circled at the bottom. It is good to know that it's not really meaningful to compare the total terpene from a lab A to a lab B, because it just depends on the amount of terpene that they've been tested. The more terpene you test, the higher that total terpene will be. So it might be good information if you've been testing multiple labs over the time, and then you can compare sticking with the same lab, but lab to lab is not really good information. For terpene analysis, it is an optional analysis. It is not required by Health Canada, but it's quite popular in the industry because we often see it on the labels, and people like to have that information.
And I guess it's important to note as well, terpene testing is not required by Health Canada, but it really is a smart thing to do, especially if you want to differentiate your product from other products. And actually, just going back to another point I just remembered with microbiology, important, I think, to ask your lab how they perform their microbiology testing. Is it rapid method or is it traditional? You will see a lot more passes with rapid method, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your product is free and clear. You could end up with some problems downstream. It is a little bit controversial, rapid method versus traditional microbiology. This is another area where you could ask for education from your lab, and they should be happy to walk you through that. So to wrap this up, again, C45 would like to thank you for attending. This recording is going to be available on YouTube in the next couple of days. You can go over to the C45 YouTube channel and subscribe, and you'll get notification when it's up and running, and you can share it with people. We invite you also to, of course, check out the C45 Association website, which is c45association.com. Become a member, join in the education. You'll have discounts to the summit, and you'll have access to a lot of experts and expert thinking. As well, C45 does from time to time communicate with Health Canada, and you can also have the opportunity to join in committees that are doing some great work. And my name's Stephanie Ostrander. My contact information is here as well. You can find me individually on Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn, as well as Keystone Labs. And I'll let Rochelle speak for a moment about her contact information, where to find her and Phytochemia.
So again, you can find my contact there. If you have any question, please reach out. You can contact me through either phone or email. You can find me on LinkedIn. If not, our laboratory is quite active on Facebook. And that's wrap up for me.
Okay, thanks everybody. And stick around for the Q&A portion as well. Hello, everybody.
Okay, so that was it for the presentation. Maybe now we can move on to the Q&A part for this webinar. How about we start with the question in the Q&A box? The first question I got here is from Jovan, who's asking how many COAs can be generated for the same lot. I guess it depends on the lab. Let's say at Phytochemia, we would have 1 COA per analysis. But then, okay, and then there's another part to the question, which is says, for example, if one sample fails specification, can a manufacturer send another sample for testing in hope that the second sample will pass? In the GPP that Health Canada has on their website, it says that this practice is actually not really recommended. If one lot is tested multiple times, it would be because it's part of the regular practice in your SOP. So let's say if you send a sample to test for a lot, for example, if your regular practice is to send 2 samples all the time, then it's fine. But if you're testing your lot over and over and over, hoping that it will pass, this practice is not really tolerated by Health Canada. Maybe now we can go on the next question from Jeremy, who's asking, what do you report when the value is below LOD or the LOQ? We actually got a memo from Health Canada recently about that. It was saying that what the producer should report when it's below LOD or LOQ would be, let's say if your LOQ is 0.1, then you would report less than 0.1. It would not be accurate to report 0 because this is not a true information. So if you can report less than and the actual value. Next question here from Tamara. We have, is the assay the method that needs to be validated? Do the lab offer some of attestation of use of validated method? If I understand the question correctly, yes, the assay and the method would be the same. So the method validation would be the report that you can ask to your lab. And you can read that report. If you're not sure, I guess, to understand everything in this report, you can always ask questions to your lab. And it's good also to see what the method validation covers. In the presentation, Stephanie was putting the pesticides as an example. It's good to make sure that all the 96% pesticide would be validated, but it's also good to verify if what matrices are covered by the validation. Is it only cannabis? Is it also if you're having edible extracts, ash, or other matrices? You have to check that this enters the scope of the validation. Would you like to answer other questions, Stephanie, or I can keep going?
Go ahead.
Okay, so
There's a few
next
more
question.
that you're better to answer.
I have another question here from Tamara, who's confused with COA and spec sheets. So the COA is the certificate of analysis. It is the document provided by the lab. So that document would have the lot number, the results, the method. So it's the document that you receive from your lab. The spec sheet is a document that is on your hand. So the producer has to build their own spec sheet. And it's a document that says for all the lots that you produce, what is the analysis that you pick that you want to test on your cannabis, and what are the limits that you pick as well. So that would be the spec sheet. The spec sheet is more a guide of what you should do in your quality process, and the COA is the result for a specific lot. Where on the COA is the anhydrous result? Depending on some labs, it can be specified which one is the anhydrous result. Some lab could report only the anhydrous result or only the result as is. So it's good to ask your lab if you're not sure what is the result to make sure that you report the good one. Wow, there's a lot of questions that are coming in. Okay, another question here from Av. Did you say best sample or representative sample? Can you share what do you do when you receive a sample? Example, liquid nitrogen, grind. Well, what we do when we receive the sample could really depend from what lab to lab. Not all lab will have the same method, although they could be very similar. So most lab will grind the sample when they receive it to homogenize the sample, but as if they use liquid nitrogen or pulverized grind, it's always better to ask your lab what they actually do. And for the best sample, it is a representative sample. You want to send something that would look like your final product. And in order to do so, it's always good to have internal SOPs to explain how to gather a representative sample, especially if you have a lot of employees. Everybody can have different understanding of sampling, so it's good to have SOPs for that.
And I'll just add is with the best sample, it does say for labs are not supposed to manipulate the sample once they receive it in terms of grooming it. So what I was saying about send your best sample is make sure there aren't any sticks and leaves and seeds. Any additional material will dilute your results. So send a good sample, but absolutely it should be a representative sample.
Okay, so maybe we can move on to a next question. Now we have another question from Jason, who's asking, how do labs handle method validation for new classes of product? For example, can the lab apply the same validated method to test for percentage of cannabinoid on brownies 1 versus brownies 2 with different ingredients and interference? Usually, good practice would be to validate it all new class of product. In the case of brownies 1 versus brownies 2, if the ingredients are really different and we notice interference, we would probably need to do another validation. If the sample seems to be somewhat similar through the analytical process, then we could consider that it covers the validation. But it is really important to have like all matrices validated. So it's good to check with your lab.
Yeah, I know at Keystone, we will also offer verification, and that is to ensure that the additional ingredients are not interfering with, you know, either the cannabinoids or the microbiology. So it is important that you ask your lab how they will handle new products.
Okay. So now I have another question from Claude Robert, who's asking, do you know if there is any testing done for beneficial insect residues or the substance used to carry them, like vermiculite? I'm not quite sure, maybe Stephanie, I don't know if you have more information on that. For insects residue, I think there's the foreign matter analysis. So that one is more a visual analysis just to see if they're foreign matter that should not be in your sample. I'm not sure if that would be the insects residues you're talking about. I don't know, Stephanie,
I think if you have enough insect residue, like a sample size, which I would imagine would be really tough to do, a lab would be able to do, you know, pesticides, heavy metals. The best way to have this question answered actually is to phone a company like Copert, or I forget the other company that deals with beneficial insects, but I would ask them about if there has been any studies done on this. I think that would be really important. And then, I mean, for substrates in general, most cannabis labs can test these. Also, you might want to give A&L Labs a call because they are an agriculture-based lab and they might have a good answer for this. We missed a question from Ahmed, who is having some technical issues, and he missed a slide about pesticides and mycotoxins. Ahmed, could you contact either myself or Rochelle by phone or email, and we can explain the slide to you, and we can also share our slide, our PowerPoint as well, if that helps anybody. Just contact us, phone or email. So I'll keep going down. Jenny Bezov, can the final lot COA issue date be earlier than the package date shown on the COA, as all testing are done, but product has not been packed as finished goods yet? Is this acceptable practice? Rochelle, do you know the answer to this one?
I'm not fully sure, but I think it would be acceptable if the product have not been further transformed, or if it's handled too much after it's been tested, it could be a risk for micro.
Yeah.
So I would say probably the ideal case would be to test it when it's fully packaged and you don't handle it, you don't transform it further.
Yeah. That would be my thinking.
But that's a bit outside of my scope as a chemist working in a lab, so I'm not fully sure here.
Yeah, that's true. If there's anybody who is listening and knows the answer to this, you could go in the chat box and answer this one. At C45, we do have a lot of quality assurance people. They are together on a Slack channel, and these are the kind of questions that could best be answered by another group out of the association. Andy Liu asks, what are the popular solvents that need to be analyzed? So you only need to test the solvents that you are using. So if you are using butane, then you have to test for butane, et cetera, et cetera. Rochelle, do you want to jump in on this one because you were presenting on solvents?
Yeah, for that question, I'm not really sure what's popular because I
It
feel
is.
like for now, like the market is a lot on dry cannabis, so we don't have
What-
as much 2.0 products. So what is popular in the solvents? I'm not quite sure. I would say that probably it would be best practice to use solvents that are less harmful for health, because they have like there are a different grade of solvents. So if you're, I think it's the class 1 is usually solvents that are less dangerous. So it's probably better to use that, but sometimes you're just limited by the product you're trying to do. So
Yeah, I think some of the more popular ones are butane, ethanol, of course, CO2. Those are the ones that we most commonly see. What would you recommend if you sent 2 samples to separate labs and one came back positive for 4 different pesticides and the other came back negative for all pesticides? Then you send another sample to another lab and it again tests negative for all pesticides. So not all labs are the same. And this goes back to asking your lab some big questions. Do they have a validated method? And was each one of the 96 pesticides validated? Another question would be to see if there was visible pesticides that were under the limit that were not reported because they were below the limit. We have seen in some cases where a lab will not report that the pesticide was below the limit but visible. And again, if, for example, if a lab is not using 2 pieces of equipment to see all 96 pesticides, you might want to consider this. There are gold standard labs, and they are going to be doing things quite similarly. And these are tough questions that you really need to ask your lab. Another question is, are they using freshly prepared standards for all of the pesticides? So you will find a big difference in labs. Some of them, rather than validating all 96 of the pesticides, they will do about 20 or 30, and then they extrapolate that information. Unfortunately, there are some really tough pesticides to see, and you have to do them individually. So these are hard questions for your lab. If one lab is reporting on the pesticides, look at what type of a lab that is compared to the other ones. And the lab that is going to be forthcoming with a conversation about how they did their validation and what they do in their lab, that's the lab you're going to want to trust more. And if you have one of the labs has their ISO certification or GMP certification, they are bound to those certifications. So they, they're not going to cut any corners. As well, a lab that's been in business a long time in another industry is really experienced with this. And so there's different ways where you could get down to the bottom of this. But if you have visible pesticides and then your product is going to be go to an extraction company, you need to know that that pesticide is then going to be concentrated. So if downstream product is never going to be tested again for pesticides for any reason, then great. Your raw material has been tested once. That's great. But we are seeing downstream products being tested. We are seeing a pass in the raw material, and then after extraction, a fail. So you do need to be careful with that and just weigh your own risk. Yeah. Ruby, is it acceptable by Health Canada for the THC and CBD potency values be reported as it is or should be within certain limits for all the lots at all times. I'm not sure if I understand that question actually. It would be great if you had product consistency, but with a plant like this, where harvest to harvest, even in the same cultivar, you can get quite different results. I think the better way to look at this is to not move around labs in order to get the result that you want. What you really want is for your lab to report, and when you have those results, that you look at your own process to try to improve your process and create product consistency. And that's really important. You can shop around at different labs and get a lot of different results, but my thinking is that Health Canada is going to notice that you're using different labs. I think you want the absolute honest potency sample with the lab that you trust. That's my thinking. Damien, do different labs ask different quantities for testing? Yes, I do believe labs do ask for different sample sizes. Is there a minimum and maximum amount? What happens if you have to retest? So if there's leftover sample, it goes in the vault. If they need it for retesting, they can pull it from the vault. Always a good idea to send some extra sample. If you only send 1 gram for potency, which is usually the minimum that's required, that's not a lot of product for a batch lot representation. So talk to your lab about this one.
If I may add here, sorry to interrupt, Stephanie, is that it's not to the lab to decide the sample size. It's actually the producer to decide what is a representative sample. So by that, it means whatever you consider representative is the sample size you want to send. If you consider that 100 gram is representative, then you can send 100 gram. It's possible that the lab asks for a minimum of 20 gram or that asks for a minimum of 5 gram, but whatever your lab asks, in the end, it's mostly your decision.
We have a few more minutes and our Zoom call might abruptly end. So I do encourage those whose questions were not answered to contact us directly. I see questions in the chat box as well as the Q&A category. I apologize that we had to cut it at an hour. I think this next question is probably more for you, Rochelle. It's terpenes and accuracy from Justin.
What was the one in the chat box? Yeah.
Does testing for more terpenes give a more or less accurate result or a less consistent result versus other labs? I think you answered that one in the presentation, and the presentation will be posted on YouTube in the next couple of days. Kate asks, what would the lab do if a sample was set in via fresh frozen format? Is this recommended in the case of cannabis grown for extraction? Yes, you can send fresh frozen. It probably won't be frozen by the time it reaches the lab, and it will go through the same sample prep process as any other sample. Christopher asks, if you're testing for heavy metals on the final product, why would you need or want to monitor your incoming water supply if there is no issue on the final product? That's because of equipment. If your equipment is not running properly and you have shavings, you could get a failed heavy metal result because of what's happening in the manufacturing process. So actually, you don't just want to look at your water supply. If you're talking about raw material, there is the media that the plant is grown in. The plant will uptake anything, and you definitely want to test your raw material for heavy metals. There's lots of preventative testing that can be done, which is quite important. And Christopher, if you have more questions about that, you can contact us directly. I apologize that we didn't have enough time to get to the chat box questions. And thank you very much for joining us today. Again, you can reach us directly, and I'm pretty sure Zoom is going to shut off. I'll keep, yeah. I think I'm not sure if everybody disappeared or not.
We're still here.
Everybody okay, if everybody.
But thanks everyone for joining us today. And I hope that was informative and you enjoyed and learned something out of it today. And
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, and connect with C45.